Welcome everyone to this second part of our Healing the Racial Divide. Last week we had a deep week, a very profound sharing. This week we have some wonderful speakers, which Patricia Powell will be introducing in just a minute. You'll also have a lot more opportunity to participate if you wish, because the speakers will all be allowing for lots of questions. So just a reminder that this is a circle of healing. It's not a process group. We also said that last week. We said last week, this is a circle where we have an opportunity to ask questions and deeply listen to each other with values of mutual respect and honor. And I wanted to just go over a couple, before I turn it over to Patricia, a couple of technical things. The first one has to do with the chat. A lot of us came together and felt that we wanted to ask people to only put something in the chat room if there's some kind of real need for clarification on, maybe something technical, and that it's best to save any chat messages that you feel are really important to be between the breaks, because the reason being is that there's a lot of very deep sharing going on, and that when we have to kind of listen and then read the chats, it's a lot. So we'd like to try that this time. And just a reminder that this is being recorded, so if you don't want to be recorded, to please turn your video off. And there's even an option to rename yourself if you'd like. And also please make sure that unless you're speaking that you're on mute, so that we don't get any feedback. And so I wanted to just also really briefly share, we may put this in the chat for technical purposes as people come in, that if you do want to ask a question, if you click on the participants list that's at the bottom of your Zoom screen, then on the list of participants at the bottom of that, there's an option to raise your hand. So when the speaker announces that they're ready for questions, if you have a question, then just raise your hand and we'll answer them first come, first serve. And what happens is you will get a message that will be sent to you that says to unmute your mic. Okay, so really looking forward to having everybody ask whatever questions they want. And each speaker has 55 minutes, and then we'll take a 5-minute break before the next speaker. And so I'm going to turn it over to Patricia Powell at this moment in time. And sorry, I did forget to say this. Haruna, unfortunately, had a work emergency where he was called into something that he could not get out of. So I just wanted to let everybody know that, we're going to miss his presence, and he felt very sad that he wasn't able to attend this session. So I wanted everybody, did want to presence that. Okay, Patricia.
Hi, everybody. I'm really happy to see all of you. I'm happy that you're here again for part 2 of the series. Last week was soft and strong and heartful. I appreciate your deep listening. This week I've brought in some speakers to give you a lot of information so you can make really good decisions going forward. My intention for the series is to give you a lot of knowledge so you can go out into the world in the way that feels right for you and create justice. Our first speaker is Suzanne Plihcik. Hi, Suzanne. Suzanne is a community organizer, a trainer, and a facilitator living in Greensboro, North Carolina. She's co-founder and associate director of the Racial Equity Institute. She works locally and across the nation to assist communities and organizations working to strengthen grassroots and institutional relationships through an increased understanding of systemic racism. Susan, welcome to BBSH and to the Healing the Racial Divide series. I'm really excited to meet you and to have this conversation with you. I decided to create this series after Mr. Floyd's murder. A few days after his death, I received an email from Lisa. She wanted to create a space for students of the program, for Black students of the program, to talk about these times, to talk about the hurt and suffering that's happening. And I said that was a great idea. And we also needed to create a context so that people could have a better understanding of why we're here. I subscribed to The New Yorker. I heard your interview on a podcast and decided to reach out to you. I wanted a white person to speak to this community that's primarily white. I believe that it's probably easier for white people to listen to other white people, though I'm not sure if that's true, but that's what I believe. Maybe you can tell me what your experience has been. And I was also inspired by your many years of doing racial equity work. I love this community at BBSH with all of my heart. We're healers. We work with energy and consciousness. I know that knowledge and understanding and analyses of how race matters work in our country will be essential in our task to shift the national and global consciousness around race, racism, and white supremacy. Suzanne, thank you for coming. I want to start off with three main questions that everyone is talking about these days.
Patricia, if I might interrupt, please forgive me. This is just a point of order, so to speak, but I'm not associate director of the Racial Equity Institute. I'm co-founder, and I still train. But I didn't want that going out on your recording to the wide world. So thank you for letting me interrupt and make that small correction.
So I want to start off with three main questions that everyone is talking about these days, Suzanne. What is white privilege? What is white fragility? What is systemic racism? What do all these things mean? But first, how did you become a race worker?
Well, it was a long journey and it was a long time ago. I sometimes say that there's no particular set of events. It's like everything else in one's life. One thing leads to another and to another, and there are all these little grace notes in that journey that tend to point you in certain directions. From the time I was very young, I saw a lot of pain and suffering. I could see it, and I could see poverty not in my home, but around me. And it was very disturbing. And the older I got, and once my children were born, those very disturbed feelings only grew. They didn't go away. And I thought, well, what does one do? And I did what most people do or think of doing when you see need. When you see need, you feel the need. And so I went through a long period of very charity-oriented approaches to need. If people needed shoes, we got shoes. If people needed homes, we got homes. If people needed food, we got food. But it was very obvious very soon that those are not permanent solutions. And no one, while their needs are met, and that's a critically important thing to do, no one is left with the ability to meet their own needs from charity. So I thought, well, what would change that? What in the world would one do to get at a root cause, a causal factor that if intervened in would keep this from happening again? Not just solve the immediate need, but keep this from happening again. And my answer at that time was, well, public policy. We need laws. We need policy. We need policy direction. We need a strategic direction. And I went about that and worked in public policy lobbying for a long time. And nothing changed. And poverty grew. And wealth grew. And the gap grew. So it became incumbent on me and the people with whom I was organizing at the time, with whom I was working at the time, to seek a deeper cause. What is it? What is it that doesn't even let policy make the changes that people are legally bound to follow? And what I found in that deeper dive was that in this country, it's race. It's racism. And it was founded and used to divide people 400 years ago. And it has been with us for that long. So we say in our work, we have an analogy we use at the Racial Equity Institute that helps us understand where we get at this, what this is and where we get at it. And it goes like this. We say that if you have a lake on your property or close by or in a park or wherever, and one morning you woke up and there was a fish, one single fish, floating belly up dead, then it would make sense to look at that fish and see what it died from. What happened to the fish? But if you woke up one morning and half the fish in the lake were floating belly up dead, you know what it's time to do. It's time to examine the lake. What's wrong with the water? What is it that's happening institutionally and structurally that we must intervene in for change to get at the causal factors and therefore prevent the problem from occurring again? We used that analogy for quite some time, and then it became clear to us that we could clean up one lake. Let's just say a lake is, or we say lakes are institutions, representative of institutions. We could clean up the education lake and just have everything hunky-dory and go away for the summer and come back, and that lake is polluted again. So what we begin to know and see is that in our analogy, there's something that's deeper than lakes. That all 95% of the fresh water that's not frozen on this planet resides where we cannot see it, in the ground. It's the groundwater. And that groundwater can recontaminate those lakes and those streams and those tributaries if it's not clean. The groundwater are those philosophical underpinnings, our narratives about why things are the way they are. That's what the groundwater is. And racism is part of that groundwater. It doesn't live there alone, but that's where it is. It's part of that groundwater. And it's just critically important that we understand that. So that's what I have been doing ever since, is working to create a more educated populace, to create solutions that get at lakes and groundwater and don't just fish endlessly. What was your second question, Patricia?
My other question is, what is white privilege? What is white fragility?
And we have 45 minutes left to talk about white privilege and white fragility. Yes, you should laugh. You should really laugh. We, as people who have come to be called white, and that's my preferred term, but we are people who have come to be called white, are beneficiaries of systems that were put in place hundreds of years ago. We didn't ask for it. Many of us do not want it, but we get it. We get it because that is in the literal design of our systems and our institutions. It's there, it's built in. You can't give it away. And the way to not have it is to change the institutional power arrangement so that there's justice, so that things are fair for everybody. That's how you don't have it. Everybody has it. And most of the things that we have that we consider privilege, we don't actually in our work at the Racial Equity Institute say privilege, we say advantage. Because there are 14 million very poor white people in this country that live below the federal guidelines. And it's difficult to talk to them about their privilege because they are struggling and they are in pain. Poverty is not good for anybody. But what they have is a white skin advantage over a person of color in their same circumstance. So a person of color with a college degree or a master's or an advanced degree has advantage over a white person who has a part-time job and lives on government assistance. But if you compare people at their own level, then every time it will be the white person who has the advantage. For example, children in school who are very poor, they qualify for free and reduced lunch. If they are white or if they are black, we'll just use black for this moment, the white child achieves at higher levels than the black child, even though they are both qualified for federal assistance in the form of free and reduced lunch. Children who do not get free and reduced lunch, whose parents are able to pay their way, in one is black and one is white, the white child does better educationally, even though they are the same socioeconomic level. Children of wealth and in the school system, and one is black and one is white, the white child does better. But here's the data point that's incredibly troubling of those data. A white child on free and reduced lunch achieves at a higher level than a black child whose parents make over $70,000 a year. How do we explain that? We've got to ask why. How do we explain that? And that means we've got an enormous amount we have an enormous amount of questions that we need to interrogate, that we need to see into. There's an enormous amount of data that needs to be gathered, and that it needs to be disaggregated by race so that we can truly understand how that plays out. So, white privilege, back to privilege and fragility. Robin DiAngelo has made fragility a new thing that we talk about, and I think she's an excellent writer and speaker and scholar. And let's if we can just parse that out a little bit and separate it. We set up systems post 1619 when the first Africans came to Virginia, to this hemisphere. They weren't the first Africans to come, but they came in not an African ship. We began a system of an owning class and a ruling class and a serving class. That owning and ruling class was outnumbered by the serving class because we were, as you know, an agricultural economy. We needed lots of workers, and those early crops, tobacco, very, very labor intensive. I know I'm from North Carolina. Tobacco is a labor intensive crop. So we have that separation. It is done actually by giving people who will come to be called white, who were the indentured servants, but yet in the serving class, but not kidnapped and enslaved. It was done because they were in much larger numbers than kidnapped and enslaved Africans, and in much larger numbers than the ruling class. So they had to be appeased. They could challenge the authority of the colony, of the owning class. So they were given just a little bit of something, and that little bit of something, and it ranged from things. First, a little lighter punishment if they tried to run away, and then right up into getting actual land and the wherewithal to work that land. The moment they got that little something, where was their allegiance? It went immediately to the owning class, to the ruling class. And so they might run away with a kidnapped and enslaved African right up until they had something to lose. And then their allegiance changes. And that race, and then therefore race baiting through many, many years, becomes a way to separate and divide our labor force. Now that's happening in the 1600s. We had every system that we have today by the time the Constitution of the United States was ratified. Every system was already there. So ask yourself, who created them? For whom? We had every institution save one we have today by the time we argued Brown versus Board of Education. So ask yourself, who created them? For whom? White advantage is literally built into our systems. You white people didn't do it, but you inherited it. And what you inherited was a benefit that has accrued over generations that you can't give away. So, white fragility was a term that Robin DiAngelo coined. To my knowledge, that wasn't there before she. And it's a very apt phrase. It's a very apt term, because we as people who have come to be called white have had the ability to racially isolate ourselves almost unknowingly. And people of color say, what do you mean unknowingly? That is ridiculous. How could you not know you were racially isolated? But many people didn't really know. They just simply grew up in a white neighborhood. There just weren't any people of color around. I grew up in a state, they would say, that's very white. There just weren't people of color around. My school was just a white school. And regretfully, in those white neighborhoods, in those white schools, in those white communities, we were never forced to see ourselves as having a racial identity, and never forced to look at ourselves as racial beings. What else could happen? So, in our ability to isolate, in our ability to not be environments where there are many or any people of color, we become those cognitive muscles that you use to have dialogues across race just atrophy because we haven't had them. And we become what Robin describes as very fragile in those conversations or in anything that we believe confronts us as racial beings. So we too often, as white people, naturally, it's been, well, let me say this. We have been described, and I think this is a wonderful way to, while we're in metaphors and analogies and water ones in particular, white people have been, in the United States, have been described as fish in water. We don't know we're wet. We're fish. And as fish, it's doggone hard to describe the nature of wetness. And it's doggone hard to have a deep understanding of the bird's experience in water. And we have been fish in water. So we've developed habits of knowing and being that make us fragile in these conversations, that make us defensive in these conversations. And that just requires some work. That just requires wanting to do better and some work. I love one particular thing that Robin DiAngelo talks about. She talks about, actually I like quite a lot of what she talks about, but one thing she talks about is having grown up in the good neighborhood. And then she went to the good elementary school and the good high school, which got her into the good college. And then she got a good job. And she said, these things were good because of the absence of people of color. And she further said, no one, not one single person, not one mother, not one father, not one grandfather, not one minister, not one teacher, not one professor ever told her there was anything wrong with that. And there is. There's something profoundly wrong with that. And while the answer to our structural problems is not diversifying all of our organizations and all of our schools, there's something profoundly wrong with that kind of segregation. And that we need to face and look at, and we need to address. And the more we do that, the less fragile we are. We build that muscle. We build that muscle to have the conversations and to have the hard conversations and to have the conversations with an understanding that I am not the center of the universe, that whiteness is not the center of the universe. And how do I do that? With humility and strength. so that I can move issues and create justice. I believe, and I do want to, I don't know how much time you wanted for answering questions, and I do want to get to those, but I believe that we are harmed as white people because of racism. And it's a profound harm that comes to us because of racism. And one of the ways that is described was one of our trainers at the Racial Equity Institute, a young man by the name of Rob Stevens. He's a minister. He had been at a meeting at a church of a friend of mine's by the name of Reverend Nelson Johnson in Greensboro. And he was there because there had been an incident. Someone had been hurt or killed, and there have been so many, I'm not sure which one this was. But he was there at the church. And there were many white people there, mostly white ministers, at the meeting, and they began to talk about healing. And Rob said to them what I would have said. He said, "What do you have to heal from?" And Reverend Johnson said to him, "Let me push you, brother." He said, if one person has a wound they don't know they have, it is a very bad thing. If a community has a wound it doesn't know it has, that is a very dangerous thing. But if a whole population has a wound it doesn't know it has, that is catastrophic. We live in that catastrophe. We live in this moment in that catastrophe. And I am so grateful. I am so grateful to see the number of people calling on us and seeking an understanding. I am horrified by the number of years that have passed before that happened. But I am grateful and heartened to see it now. And it is my prayer that that will go deep enough to understand racism at its roots, to understand the structural reality that is racism, so that that's what we get at, so that it can end. Was there a third question, Patricia? Have I answered it possibly, or am I nowhere in your ballpark?
You've been great, Suzanne. Thank you. I think at this point, I'll open it up to the audience.
Okay.
Questions. Lisa, will you help with that?
Absolutely. So again, anyone that would like to ask a question, if you go to the participants tab and then you go, I think it's under more, you can raise your hand. Okay, we've got one, and I'm going to ask you to unmute. We're just doing them in the order, and I think hopefully it went to Regine. So feel, unmute and feel free to ask your question.
I can't hear.
You have to unmute.
Sorry. I watched a lot of talk and movies and informed myself the last few weeks. The one I looked at last night the title was I'm Not Your Nigger. A movie that just, I'm not going to go. My question to you is, could you talk about the fear and the violence? I mean, what I could see in the face of those white people was so much fear and the desire to hurt. And I just would, yeah, if you could talk about that, if it's okay.
I didn't see the movie.
Okay. But I'm sure you know the place I'm talking about.
But fear is a very basic emotion, even before anger. And I think white people are afraid. There's a cycle of violence that begins to occur. And as those violent acts are normalized and there is no accountability for them, they increase. And we have watched violence for 400 years against Black people in particular, but people of color in general. We lynched Latino people after the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo for 100 years. That violence is something we need to be a little worried about. How is it that only a generation ago, maybe 2 generations ago, people brought their family to lynchings with a picnic? Sent postcards with pictures of the lynching. How is that? How is it that bricks were thrown at young children who were trying to enter a white school and buses turned over and burned? We need to be very worried about that. And we have got to exercise, if we're going to be anything besides emotionally incapacitated by guilt and shame, we've got to exercise a lot of self-compassion and say, I will work for this never to happen again. I will work for this never to happen again in my name. And I think most of us on this journey have done that, have made that commitment. I also want to say that violence in this, we don't have time to go into all of this, but the study of it and what actually occurs is also built into our systems and our laws. And it is built into our culture. The first police were slave patrols. In 1705, we passed a law that said that white people would get a certain amount of land and a musket and some corn and a suit, and that they need not recognize the rights. This is way before Plessy. They need not recognize the rights of Black people or Indians and could kill them with impunity. 1705. So we have set up something that tells people this is okay. Now, the fact that it was bought into is a great concern, but we set it up. We did. This nation set it up, and it must be reckoned with. It must be reckoned with.
Thank you. Next question.
Adriana.
Hi, Suzanne. I wanted to ask you about the statement that you made regarding a white privilege.
Mm-hmm.
Because when you made the statement, it sounded very final, like there's no way out of this. And the statement was, you can't give it back. You can't return it.
You can't.
You can't give it back. So having that sit in me with this sort of impending doom feeling. Just
No,
sort of reaching out to now
I don't
what?
want you to feel that. I don't want you to feel that. I want you to feel enormously hopeful, because we're going to do this. We are doing this. We're going to do it. We are doing it. So I don't want anyone not to feel hopeful. Matter of fact, it's our job to be hopeful. Cynicism is the enemy of the movement. The enemy of the movement. We've got to stay in this movement, and we've got to know we are going to one day end this, because we are. We are. And hope is just so important. But I like to think of hope a little like Tony Kushner. You familiar with Tony Kushner, the playwright Angels in America? I don't know if you're all younger than I, but anyway. Tony Kushner is a very, I believe, extraordinary playwright. He wrote a play called Angels in America, but he also did a speech, a commencement speech at Vassar. And one of the things he talked about in that speech, besides that we all need to organize, we need to organize collectives of people that are building power to challenge power. But one thing he says is hope is not naive. It's at home in the darkness. And we have to come to see it that way. We've got to be hopeful, but we've got to be hopeful with the brutal facts. We must know what we're up against. And we're up against a lot. We're up against a lot. But it is not useful to not tell the truth about what that is. And what we're up against, for us not to have privilege, doesn't make us bad people. I mean, don't go to the binary. Doesn't make us bad people. You inherited this, I inherited this. But it does make us people that have work to do and need to change. But not bad. We are decent people. But we have to end this to not get privilege, because it is baked into everything. It's a little bit like the moving sidewalk at the airport. Beverly Daniel Tatum and Tema Oakland talk about the moving sidewalk at the airport. If we ever go to airports again, I'm not sure. But if you're a white person, if that sidewalk is racism, it's just moving you along. You don't have to, you just stand still. That sidewalk is moving you along. Just do your job. Show up at work, mow your grass, raise your children, cook your food, and that sidewalk is moving you along. So Tema says, it's incumbent upon us who are being moved along, unasked for, to turn around and walk against it. That's what we got to do. And we can do that, and we can make headway. But the privilege you didn't ask for, you didn't, you don't have any control over giving it back. You just don't. I can't walk into a store and say, you know, would you follow me instead of Patricia today? I've just noticed you're following Patricia around this store to see if she's going to take anything. Just follow me. I'm going to take this for Patricia today. I can't do it. I wish we could, but we can't do it. So we got to end the system that created it, the system that's still working.
Thank you, that's helpful.
Thank you. Thank you. Next question.
Julie Murray.
Yes, I am so moved, Suzanne, by not only what you're saying, but the way energetically you're transmitting it, because it's so deeply part of you.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
And I'm appreciating what I'm receiving as I listen to you. And everything you said has moved me deeply. But when you said we are harmed as white people by racism, that feels to me as though it's been the key in my own turning around on that moving sidewalk. And I know exactly when it happened. You know, I thought of myself as someone who in my adult life, I grew up in a totally isolated white system until I went to college in Boston. And then I lived in Europe and things changed for me. But it wasn't until the slaughter in Mother Emanuel Church and I saw those Black people as vessels of grace. They weren't denying their pain. They weren't whitewashing it, but they weren't reacting in revenge either. And that's when I understood that the Black community has a gift to give me that I can't find anywhere else. And as I slowly have found authentic ways of being an ally with people of color in their faith communities and allowed them to teach me, the answer to my question is, what has made you capable of not taking revenge? I'm beginning to have my heart changed. So my question to you is, how can that happen for more and more of us?
Well, I'm going to take that apart just a bit. It is incredible what the church members who didn't seek revenge did. And it is imperative that we seek justice.
Yes.
It is imperative that these things don't occur again. And we have to seek that even when we do it loud of voice with fist pounding. Because we can't heal without that justice. And that justice doesn't mean that we find the perpetrator and hang them up by their heels or their neck or their whatever. That justice means you fix this so it doesn't happen to anybody else. That's what it means. And that's not an easy thing to seek. The next thing that I would ask you to just look in your heart for is the harm that racial isolation has caused us. The harm that has been done to us because of what has been done in our name. And examine that and face that, which is not an easy thing to do. But when it's examined and faced, I can predict that what you'll find is this is your issue, not people of colors. This is yours. And that you needn't be an ally to them. They can be an ally to you to change what has gone on and the systems that benefit us so profound. Yeah. And to look at your place as not a central place, but as having a role to play in a larger schema. An important role to play in a larger schema of which we as white people are a part, but not the whole. So those things, I think, are part of the journey, part of what we need to do, part of the reflection that needs to occur, so that we ensure that we don't bring our white ways, our white cultural ways, which are not all bad. It's the difficulty with them is we've imposed them on everybody else. So that we don't bring those ways of thinking into our anti-racist work. Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Next question.
Susan Gibson.
Hello.
Hi.
One of the things that I have really been noticing as I have been speaking up on my Facebook page, as I've been talking to people and raising awareness about racism, is that I find that a lot of times white men will attack. And I haven't quite been able to figure out what that all is, but it feels almost like they feel betrayed by white women speaking up.
You're a race traitor. So do you want me to
speak
I don't
on
think
that?
you were finished.
Whatever you have to.
White men, oh, can't live with them, can't live without them. It's part, we have a gender socialization that is just as powerful, as you know, is almost as powerful anyway as our racial socialization. So we have a pretty profound gender socialization that we're up against as well in that regard. And that is compounding in terms of that defensiveness and anger and all of those things. Although I've got to say, I've been doing this work a long time. You can look at me and tell I've been around a long time, and I see a change. I see a softening. I see. I mean, when we did this 20 years ago, there were rooms we just had to get out of. There were times we just had to stop talking. And we don't, with that, you know what, maybe today we'll get certain pushback, but it's not what it once was. And we get more people in the room. I will say that the population, the demographic that is least present in our trainings is white men. So it's hard to get them there. And once they get there, they struggle. They struggle. And they feel blamed. And that's a product of our culture. It is a product of how we train people and what we say and how we learn. It's a product of our culture. And our culture and white culture, we are very dichotomous in our thinking. Things are either good or they're bad, they're right or they're wrong. And I find men struggle with that more than women. That they have a more dichotomous way of thinking. It's more pronounced in them. And that's just a broad general statement that I probably shouldn't have generalized quite that much. But in that dichotomy, anytime you speak of this, people don't hear right off what you have said. What they hear is the heuristic question. What they hear is, you are calling me a racist. You are telling me that I am bad, that I am a bad person. And I find that in that heuristic question, that our brain literally changes what has been said. it makes it really hard to continue the conversation because they've really stopped it in so many ways. So I find it's useful to start out with people whom I know will be resistant or defensive by establishing you're a good person. You're a decent person. I'm going to challenge you anyway, but I will never question your innate goodness and worth and sacredness. That'll never be on the table. And it helps a little bit. It helps a little bit. It's so interesting how our brains, we do a little bit of implicit bias work, not much because we think it's been overblown, but it's so interesting how our brains work. We had a presentation to a group of police officers some years ago, and the sergeant who was in charge of the group, I believe they were school resource officers, if my memory serves, and the sergeant who was over this particular group of officers, after we completed a presentation, came up to us and he said, I just do not agree with you, but it's undeniable. What do you say? So that's what happens to our poor little brains. You know, it's getting information it doesn't want. It wants to push it back out. It doesn't want to hear it. It does, you know, and so doing it in a way that you can just kind of get through that door can be useful. But yes, it's a question, and it's one that deserves attention and interrogation.
Thank you so much.
We have 5 more minutes. Is there one question, or Suzanne, would you like to wrap up for us?
Well, is there something someone just felt like we didn't get to that is hanging out there in the universe?
There's 2 more people with their hands up.
I can't see who has hands up, so someone will have to call.
Chuck would be next.
Okay.
Hello, hello, and thank you for your many years of dedication to this really hard work. I know your voice well from the Seeing White podcast.
Oh, for heaven's sake.
Lynn and Chandra Kumanika, so thank you. I have a very close friend from college. I'm in my mid-50s, and so is he. He went to Harvard Business School as a graduate student and has been very successful and has, really walked through the halls of corporate and financial power. He's a CEO of a company. He's been CEOs of other companies. We're still very close, even though we've had very different paths in life.
Mm-hmm.
But I've more recently, we talk maybe once every few weeks, been more recently talking to him about racial issues. Not pushing it, we talk about everything. He got extremely agitated and he shared with me his view on what Black Lives Matter is really about, based on a Black woman he saw walking in a parking lot refusing to get out of the middle of the lane. And he had to wait and drive slowly behind her until she got out of the middle of the lane. And it was the most venom I've ever heard him talk about. And we went on to talk, and he's, one of his perspectives on the world is that people of our age now are running the country. And I don't feel that way about myself, but that's how he sees it. And he has a friend group who's very much in the similar status that he is. And we started talking a little about reparations, and he's also vehemently against that. And he basically said to me, Chuck, it's your job to convince us about reparations. And I love him dearly. I mean, we have been through so many experiences together in life, but this is the first time we've really touched on something so live wire. And I haven't talked to him since we had that conversation, actually, but we've emailed a couple times. My question is, reparations is a very wide subject and very multi-layered, and it isn't just giving money to people, but that's how he sees it. Do you have any guidances or suggestions for me or anyone else who's interested in how to talk to someone like that about this subject?
Know the history of why we need reparations. Know the history of this country like you know the back of your hand. Know
I learned a lot from you.
Yeah, you can call every date, you can call every act, you can call every piece of discriminatory legislation in action from 1607 to 2020. So you know why we need reparations, because you can literally paint that picture for someone. You can paint the picture of white advantage that is structurally built into our country. If you don't have an hour and a half or 4 hours to do that, you might start by just simply, but I mean, you've got to make the case. You can't argue reparations if there's no rationale. And you can do a continuum, and you can go from 1619, first ship that hits Virginia with 20 Africans. And that is chattel slavery until 1865. How many years is that? What percentage of our history is that? Chattel slavery, when not only can you not own property as a person of color, you are property. From 1865 to 1964, with the Civil Rights Act, we have Jim Crow that does not give any person of color access to the economy of this country in any way. You can't even sit on the front of the bus or sit at a lunch counter. And you certainly can't own a business in the sense that you are part of the larger economy. From 1964 to today is the only period of time people of color have actually had the legal right to be a part of the economy. That's a pretty short period of time. So what were white people doing from 1619 to 1964? They were accumulating wealth. They were building businesses. They were creating the structural reality that we know today as the United States of America. And advantage to them was being built into all of those things. So learn to make your case as in short form and in long form. And if you can get people to sit down and listen to the long form, all the better, because there's so much to know and learn. Get him to a training if you can. But then after you do that, try to reframe what he thinks is reparations. It is not handing out checks to everybody. And there's some very interesting things being proposed today. The biggest gap in our wealth gap between people of color and white people is wealth, not income. So there was no opportunity to build wealth. There's no family wealth. There's no anything to build back on. And not that there aren't poor white people. There are, most assuredly, but in a different position. So that wealth gap is really profound, and it is causing things like the opportunity to go to school for people of color means loans. And it means a lot of debt. Now, it does for some white people too, but they don't get the same jobs as white people. And so paying back those loans is debt. But if you reframe what it could look like, you can look at, he's at Duke. What is his name? Darity, Dr. Darity at Duke. He and another professor that I don't believe is at Duke have proposed what they call baby bonds. And those would be given to all children at their birth. And children of families that have means would get smaller bonds. and children of families without means would get much larger bonds. On their coming of age, whatever that is determined to be, they get their bond with all the compound interest of those years. And theirs will, if you were poor to start with, your bond is going to be bigger and therefore in better relationship to those who got the smaller bonds but have also family wealth. So they see this as an opportunity to at least begin to address the enormous wealth gap and a form of reparations, which I think would be stellar. So to make your case, have a great rationale, know it better than you know anything else, and then reframe what we're talking about when we say reparations. Also, if you read The Color of Wealth, and there's so many very good books today, you can't keep up. But what would happen to the economy were people actually employed with living wages? I mean, everything would be better for everybody. So he has a dog in the fight of making things more equal. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So that was long, and we're over, and I have a meeting, and I sure appreciate all of you. I appreciate it.
Suzanne, thank you so much.
Oh, you're
for
so
joining.
welcome. You're so welcome. My best
so
to
much.
you and the future of your work.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Hi, Kai. Could you take us through
Yes, just 1 minute, everybody. Just want to remind you that we want you here engaged, not collapsing, not going into pessimism. Right? Breath. Everybody take a nice deep breath. Notice as you breathe where your body may be holding constriction, any pain. Just bring some gentle movement, some self-massage. Invite your body to stay here with us in community, to keep looking at white privilege, challenging your fragility to grow strong in your ability to unify and move your light towards equality and justice for all. So hydrate, make any notes that you need to work on with your therapist or BIP later. Stay present as we get ready to receive more wisdom from another elder. And Suzanne, thank you so much for bringing your history and your embodiment of equality here to us. Our school is very grateful for every student, every non-student, every graduate that's here with us today. We are a family. Feel strength in that. Patricia?
I think she might have, oh, there she is.
Here I am. Thank you, Kai. So we'll just take another minute before our next presenter. Priya, are you here?
I am here.
Let's see.
You see me?
I can find you. Oh, hi there.
I'm here.
So our next guest is Priya Kandaswamy. And Priya is my colleague at Mills College in Oakland, California, where I teach. Priya is a professor of women, gender, and sexuality studies. Her work is grounded in women of color feminisms and queer people of color critique. And her research explores the workings of race, gender, sexuality, colonialism, and class in the history of the US. And she has a forthcoming book, Domestic Contradictions, Forced Labor and Gendered Citizenship, from Reconstruction to Workfare. Priya, thank you for joining us here at the Brennan School of Healing and the Healing the Racial Divide series. I want to start off with a question that will lead us into your talk. And how can you help us to understand this long, deep history that we have of anti-racism, anti-Black racism in America?
Thank you so much for having me here, Patricia, and also thank you to everyone who's here. I know a lot of these conversations are difficult to have, that this is a challenging time in a lot of different ways, and that the format of Zoom is also maybe challenging for a lot of people too. So I really appreciate people being here and engaging, and I really appreciate the opportunity to have this conversation with you. I think Patricia's question, sort of thinking about like the historical origins of anti-Black racism and how that shapes our contemporary moment, right? I mean, I think that's a big question. One of the things I think we have to think about is like, how were racial categories constituted, right, in the moment of slavery, and how do, I mean, I guess one of the ways I think about this question is, I think in the United States, we're very invested in a narrative of progress, right? Like that, you know, we used to engage in racism, right? Or we used to have slavery, and then we had emancipation, and it was over, right? And then, you know, we had Jim Crow, and then we had the Civil Rights Act, and it was over, right? And then we sort of moved into this new, much more multicultural era of American democracy, where those things are no longer a part of, right, who we are. And I think like if we want to have a real conversation about anti-Blackness, we really have to like challenge that narrative and the way that that narrative is embedded in a lot of the ways we think about things, right? So just because, right, like we had emancipation didn't mean that, right, the ideologies, the discourses, right, the things that, you know, the associations with Blackness that developed under slavery, that all of those things just disappeared, right? Like, you know, there was a scholar by the name of Lydia Hartman, and she talks about living not in an era of emancipation, but living in what she calls the afterlife of slavery, right? Like, so how do the violences, exploitation, racial ideologies that shaped the building and foundation of these countries continue to haunt us in the contemporary moment? And I think we see that a lot in like right now, right? Like, for example, we think about like the murder of George Floyd, right? Like that moment, for folks who, you know, have watched the video, it really is, right, like a reenactment of the kinds of violence that underwrote slavery, right? And so I think we have to move away from an idea that that history is over and really start to actually, in the present, think about how are we still living it? How do we grapple with its implications? How do we heal from that? So I don't know, Patricia, if you wanted to ask me more questions or if you wanted me to just talk a little bit about some concepts.
Yeah, talk a little bit about the concepts, talk a little bit about policing, talk a little bit about how many of our policies affect queer communities.
Okay, so I mean, what I wanted to maybe talk about a little bit today, I was trying to think about, so 20 minutes isn't a long time to talk about things that are like very broad and complicated. But I wanted to talk about some of the concepts that like I use in my own scholarship and my own teaching, and how I think they're useful for thinking about racism in the current moment. Because I think one of the things that is challenging, right, is that we, you know, I would say like in a community like this, right, like we all want to grapple with and sort of heal from racism, but we all don't necessarily have the same understanding of what racism is or what a racial divide is, right? And that I think a lot of times the more popular understandings that we're given of racism focus a great deal on the individual, right? So that healing from racism is something that happens interpersonally, or that racism is something that, you know, kind of like we were talking about earlier, right? Something that bad people perpetrate on other people. And I think that for us to really grapple with like the expansiveness and the deep implications of racial social structures, we have to actually think about race in a more structural way. And when I say structural, what I really mean is we have to think about how race is embedded in how our society is organized, right? So it's not just about individual beliefs, it's about like our institutions, it's about how we organize resources, it's about, you know, who has power, right? And who doesn't. And so when we come at it that way, like for me, I think we move away from it simply being about like a personal transformation, and we start to think more about what would it mean to transform society as a whole. So I have a couple of terms I want to talk about, and I'm going to try to share my screen so that I can actually just show these to you. Okay. Hopefully that works. Okay. So I really wanted to talk about like what is race, right? Because I think there's a lot of misunderstanding and slippage in the ways that people use the term. And so I draw on the work of two sociologists by the name of Michael Omi and Howard Wynot, who talk about race with kind of a technical definition, but I'll kind of try to break it down a little bit as a concept which signifies and symbolizes social conflicts and interests by referring to different types of bodies. And what I think is important about this definition is that Omi and Wynot were really trying to intervene in a couple of really popular misconceptions about race. So like one intervention they're making is to say that race is not an essence, right? So like race isn't about something essential or inherent in a particular individual, but rather that race is a social construction, meaning that our race is shaped not by necessarily something biological or natural about who we are, but rather by the context that we're in, right? And that at the same time, race is not, like I think the flip side of the like race is an essence is that race is an illusion, right? That race isn't really real. So we've all encountered people who say like, I don't see color, or race is just, you know, an invention, right? That for Omi and Wynot, race is real, right? And that it has real effects, right? That it has an impact on how people live their lives in the structures that they live in. So in this definition, what they're saying is that race is a concept that's rooted in a location, right? A history, a geography, right? That race is something that has a social context, right? So if we want to understand race better, we have to think about a social context that it's in. That race shifts and changes, right? Like it's a concept, it's not a fixed entity. So one of the examples I always give my students is like, if I took me, right? It's like in the context that I live in now, my racial identity might be seen as Asian or South Asian, right? If you put me in a time machine and you sent me back to California 150 years ago, I might have been seen as Asiatic, right? If you put me on a plane and you sent me to South Africa, I might be considered colored, right? Nothing in my body is changing, the context around me is changing, right? So it's actually a social context that creates racial categories, not, right, something inherent in a person. And then I think the most important part of this definition is that race is something that symbolizes social conflicts and interests, right? So race isn't just, and I think this is important in thinking about power, right? Race isn't just different ways of classifying people, but rather that those classifications are linked to social constructions of power, right? Like, so they're linked to how things are distributed. So in Omi and Wanat's framework, right, what the important question to ask about race is not, for example, like when we think about racial stereotypes, is not to ask, is the stereotype true or not? Like, I think a lot of times we put a lot of energy into talking about how stereotypes are untrue. Omi and Wanat want us to focus instead on what work does the stereotype do, right? What power relationships does it rationalize? What inequalities does it enable, right? So when we start to think about like racial discourse, we start to think about representations of race, it becomes important to ask, like, why is this particular story about race being told, right? How does that enable something to happen, right? For Omi and Wanat, racial formation is a process, it's a historical process by which categories of race are constructed, by which, right, those categories shift and change over time. So race isn't stable, right? Rather, it's something that is being created as society changes. So if we're going to think about, for example, whiteness and anti-Blackness, I think, right, like a common narrative is that, right, you know, back when, right, slavery was developing, right, white Europeans enslaved Black Africans and brought them to the Americas to labor, right? The way that this sort of formulation of race sort of rethinks that is to actually draw attention to the fact that it was actually through the institutions of slavery, right, that some people became regarded as white and some people became regarded as Black, right? So when we think about kind of like the diversity of the African continent, the way the diversity of the African continent becomes represented as Black in the US context or in the context of the Americas is actually through legal codes that mark these particular populations as enslavable, right? And so what thinking about race this way like helps us see is that Blackness itself, right, is a construct that is sort of inextricably linked to these processes of slavery, right? Similarly, when we think about like whiteness, or, you know, as the language that Suzanne was using, right, like people who are categorized as white, what whiteness, right, has meant in the law, or what it meant in the law, right, at the inception of this country was that people who were white were people who could not be enslaved, right? We were people whose property rights in themselves were respected, and people who, right, were sort of outside of the category, right, of people who could be enslaved. So we're going to think about how, in this context, it's not, race doesn't just exist, rather race is constructed, right, through a set of historical processes that are about power and exploitation. Okay. I'm going to move a little bit through a couple of these things a little bit quickly because I know we don't have that much time. But then in thinking about racism, one of the things I just wanted to draw your attention to, like, again, I think a lot of times when we think about racism, we think about it in terms of individual prejudices. And so what I really want to like emphasize is thinking about race in terms of race and racism in terms of structural processes. So a geographer by the name of Ruth Wilson Gilmore, right, defines racism as a state-sanctioned and/or extra-legal production and exploitation of group-differentiated vulnerabilities to premature death. And what I want to emphasize in this definition, or why I think it's a good definition, is because it focuses on the impact of racism, right? It sort of thinks about the ways in which what racism is. It's not about, right, prejudice or prejudgment. Racism is a set of processes that produce, right, the premature death of people who are racialized, right? And so in that definition, I think it shifts our conversation away from how do we deal with our internal prejudices to thinking about how do we remedy the impacts of racism, right? So for example, how do we make it so that people don't die of police violence? How do we make it such that the impacts of disease are not, distributed in racially differentiated ways, right? Like, so for example, in this country, the life expectancy of a white man is considerably longer than the life expectancy of a Black man, right? A definition like this, starts to ask why, right? And what can we do to make it such that it's not that case? I think it also makes us sit with, right, like a deep understanding of racism as something that steals life, right? Like as a life-ending process, and sort of to grapple with the gravity of understanding it that way. And then I just wanted to talk briefly about the concept of intersectionality as well, which is, I think, a term that more and more people are using, but one that I think is important because I think a lot of times our conversations about race and racism become divorced from other kinds of discussions of structural oppression. So, right, like, so we think about racism here, we think about sexism here, we think about ableism over here, and we're not necessarily thinking about them together. But as human beings, right, we're all always experiencing them at the same time. So it's somewhat of a fiction to say that we could, experience race and racism without also, right, experiencing, for example, gender and sexuality. So intersectionality is a concept that's developed by Kimberly Crenshaw, who's a legal theorist, to think specifically about how race and gender are interconnected, though I think we can use it to think about other kinds of interconnections as well. Crenshaw was particularly concerned with the ways in which conversations about race tend to center the experiences of Black men. And so in particular, so like, for example, today we might think about police violence, right? And what kinds of, or which cases of police violence receive a great deal of attention and how those cases of police violence are understood. And Crenshaw might draw attention to the fact that we tend to think about police violence as something that is primarily impacting Black men. But in fact, right, there are many cases of police violence that impact Black women, that impact queer and trans Black folks, but they don't receive the same kind of attention because of a tendency to think about race, right, in isolation from other structures of oppression. At the same time, right, Crenshaw argued that when we think about gender, we're often thinking about white women, right? And so we think about gender as something that happens, that is not racialized and therefore by default white. And in the process, right, like these two schools of thought, so we're thinking about race over here and gender over here, can't really account for or theorize or address the experiences of Black women, women of color, of queer people of color, right? And so she uses this term intersectionality to help us think about how race is always gendered and gender is always racialized. And think about, one of the examples she uses is thinking about discrimination law. So in the United States, discrimination law is structured such that you can either be discriminated against based on race, or you can be discriminated against based on gender. And she talks about this particular case in which a group of Black women were arguing that a company discriminated against them because they refused to hire Black women. And in that case, they didn't have any legal standing, right? Because you can't be discriminated against in US law based on the intersections of race and gender. The law treats those two things as distinct, right? And so she's arguing for the fact that we have to understand that how we experience race is always shaped by our gender. How we experience gender is always shaped by our race as well. And that when we start to sort of look at social problems from more intersectional frames, we might begin to ask different questions about those things. I'm just going to talk very quickly about about police violence a little bit, and then I'll just open it up for questions so we can talk about any of these things in more depth. So a couple of just very quick points I wanted to make when we think about police violence in this current moment, and a lot of the organizing that is happening against police violence is trying to think about what are the dominant narratives that we see about police violence and how those dominant narratives might be expanded or sort of might start to look different once we take a kind of a more structural or more historically grounded approach. So when we talk about police violence in the United States, or when we're shown images of it, I think that there tends to be kind of two different mainstream narratives of that. So one is, right, like an idea that it's justified, right, that the police are justified in using excessive force, and that is grounded in a racialized construction of Black people as criminals, right? And I think in some of the questions that came up earlier, maybe this is something we can talk about more a little later, right? I think those sort of representations raise this question of how do we see, right? Like, what do people see when they look at each other, and how do historical narratives shape what we see, right? And so, like, if we are inundated with like cultural ideas that link Blackness to criminality, how do people incorporate those and create a narrative in which someone who is the victim actually becomes the perpetrator, right? So, like, I think that that's one set of narratives that's important to challenge. The other set of narratives is a set of narratives that is about the police officer as a perpetrator of violence, that locates that violence in his prejudice, right? Like this idea that this is one racist cop transgressing, right, the boundaries of his profession, right? Like this is, if he was a good police officer, he wouldn't do this. He's doing this because he's a bad police officer. And I think that's also an important narrative to challenge, because it suggests that, again, the problem is individuals, right? And it doesn't take into account the ways that structures of policing are actually at work, right, in particular instances of police violence, right? So it rests on this idea, like, if you could take that one bad cop out, or if you could fix an individual, the problem would go away, which I think, right, we all sort of know that's not really the case. And so just to kind of think about, like, police violence, like, one of the questions that I would ask is, rather than think about, like, what is simply happening in that one particular moment that we might see, asking instead, what are the conditions that make police violence possible, right? What sorts of structures are in place that make it possible for, right, anti-Black police violence not just to happen, but to also be something that is widespread, that is unpunished, that has no sort of accountability. So Suzanne talked a little bit about the racist origins and history of policing, right? I would add that, like, the police origins and slave patrols, but also, right, that the institutions of policing, right, developed during the Jim Crow era with the rationale of maintaining a status quo, right, maintaining a racial order. And I think we can see, right, into the contemporary period that a primary function of policing is to continue to maintain that racial order. In addition, like, people generally talk about from the 1970s forward, right, the United States has taken this turn toward increased investment in, right, policing and prisons as solutions to social problems. And a lot of that has to do with a response to radical Black organizing of the 60s and 70s, and using policing as a mechanism of squelching, right, that kind of organizing. I think we have to think about the larger political landscape of policing, right? So from the 70s, right, into the contemporary period, being tough on crime has been a platform of many a politician, right? And many politicians have used this idea of constructing and expanding policing as a way of garnering votes, as a way of garnering resources. And I think we have to really question, right, like, you know, as a country and in many different localities, why it is we so tacitly accept policing as something that we need to keep us safe. I think we need to think about the geography of policing and racial segregation, right? So one of like the linchpins of racism in this country is residential segregation, and the United States remains as residentially segregated as it was in the 1950s. That really hasn't changed very much. And so, right, one of the things that residential segregation does in relation to policing is, you know, when we think about like, why are Black people more likely to be arrested? Why are they more likely to be victims of police violence? It's because they have so much more contact with the police, right? Because residential segregation makes it such that police are very much present, active, involved in particular communities. And then like, you know, people who live in suburban white communities rarely ever interact with them at all, right? And so part of, right, what makes police violence possible is actually the structure of residential segregation in this country, something that, you know, we all live in, right? And then I think we have to think about who benefits from policing, right, and who is harmed by it, right? And so a lot of our narratives about policing have to do with, you know, the goal of policing is to keep people safe. Like, who does policing actually keep safe? And who, you know, actually, like, for whom are the police, right, a source of, right, violence, fear, or threats to their safety, right? And so I think that those are another set of questions that we can think more about. I want to be mindful of time, and I know that people have lots of questions and things like that, so I'll just stop there, but I'm happy to talk about any of these things more. And I'm going to try to.
Thank you, Priya. Do we have questions? Natasha.
Thank you. Can you talk more on intersectionality? Because that's the first time I've heard that term and I get it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'd love to talk more about intersectionality. So, I mean, I guess the way that people often talk about intersectionality is like, it's a metaphor, right? So you think about like two roads intersecting. And part of what, like, in her original article, Kimberly Crenshaw was talking about is that, like, if this, like, one road is race and this other road is gender, people never think about, like, the places, right, where racial oppression and gender oppression meet, right? And so, like, for example, in the case of employment discrimination, she talks about how racial discrimination gets defined in ways that it can't include gender discrimination. It has to be just about race, right? And like gender discrimination gets defined in ways that it has to be just about gender. But actually, right, like if you're a woman of color, a lot of the discrimination you experience, right, has to do with the fact that you are both a woman and, right, a person of color. And so those two things coming together, unless you grapple with them together, not simply as like, and it's not like a race plus gender, right? It becomes something different when you embody both of those identities. And we could extend that to say that, like, that's also true, like, we think about the intersections of race and sexuality, right? We think about the intersections of gender and class. And so, I mean, part of what I think she's drawing attention to is the ways in which, like, a lot of times how we think about racism or how we think about sexism is still privileging more dominant people within those affected categories. Does that make sense?
Yes, I thank you. Yes, I get that. How we need to stop individualizing the problem and connect it, because that's where the main problem is at. Because disconnecting them keeps them marginalized, but connecting them is what brings the big picture to form. Is that okay?
Yeah, I think that's also a great way of thinking about it. And I mean, the other thing I would add to that then is also that people who are experiencing, for example, both racism and sexism have like an experience that gives us greater insight into those structures as a whole. You know, so like I think another thing that she would argue is that like if analysis, for example, in this case, centers the experiences of Black women, then right, like a Black feminist politics would necessarily eradicate both racism and sexism, right? And so like it is of great value to engage with and center the experiences of people who live at these intersections, because it gives us greater insight into how we don't have to tackle these structures one at a time, but how we can sort of challenge them together.
So it gives us the structural power to fix it by intersecting it. It shifts the dialogue.
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
Thank you, Natasha.
Thank you.
Another question by Declan.
Hi, thank you, Priya. I am I'm transgender. I live in Texas, and just over the last few years, we have seen such a huge increase of transgender women of color being murdered. And a woman in Houston, Dee Dee Waters, was talking about how that in 48 states, there's a law that's set up so that if somebody is with a transgender person and finds out doesn't know it, and then finds out afterwards that they're with a transgender person and murders them, that their sentence or their, I don't know, they would be convicted of a misdemeanor instead of, a heavier charge. And I'm just wondering with that, you talk about the system, and I mean, policing a lot of times, coming down from our laws, and how do we set up these laws? How do we change that besides getting more involved? And what does that, when there isn't a voice about these things that are happening, how can we change all of that? I'm thinking about for myself, even, what can I do?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I mean, a couple of things, even like the example that you're giving, like I think is a good illustration, in some ways of the limits of the law, right, to actually change things, right? Like, like that example shows so clearly how the law like is set up not to protect trans people, right? Like in that case, right? Like it's again this like idea that like the person in the dominant group is like potentially the victim of a person who has less power. And and so like if the law is set up that way, what does it mean to sort of try to think about the law even as a vehicle through which you're gonna, like, if you are of that marginalized group, you're gonna be protected, right? Like I think that like one of the things that like examples like this raise is that like, the law, policing, a lot of the dominant mechanisms that we use to sort of ensure safety and security, like they only work for some people, right? Like they don't work for other people. And they're actually deliberately set up that way, right? And deliberately set up to position those people as threats. In terms of like what to do, like that's obviously like a very large question. But one of the things like I feel very strongly is that like on the one hand, like in relation specifically to policing and the law, as a society, we need to collectively mobilize, right, to disinvest from those institutions. Like I think if you sort of look at like, I don't know, if you look at a society and think about like where we put our resources is where our values are. We disproportionately put our resources into police and prisons, and we don't put our resources into things like education, healthcare, food security, housing, right? And I mean, to me, I think like this is a particularly interesting moment to live in, because there is, right, like this growing movement of people who are saying that, you know, what we really need to do is not fix the police, is not like reform the police, is not put more resources into making the police like more racially conscious, but rather we actually need to defund the police, right? Like we need to start taking resources away from policing, and we need to start putting those into things that actually make people's lives better. You know, we need to start using those resources for education. We need to start using those resources for healthcare. And to me, I think that like that is a really like, that's a really amazing sort of political move that people are making. And it has a lot of potential, you know, and I think like individually, like what that means at a more personal level can be a lot of things, right? Like it can be participating in those movements, can be supporting those movements financially. It can also mean like, how do we as individuals disinvest from like situations from the police? Like, so for example, where I live in Oakland, there are, you know, a lot of community groups who have developed kind of ways of like, if there is a crisis in our community, we're going to commit to not calling the police, because we recognize that if we call the police, someone we care about might be harmed. But we also want to make sure our community is safe. So how do we build, right, community amongst ourselves so that we have a way of responding to violence or to harm that, you know, minimizes, right, those things, but also can produce, like, it's sort of like, as a community, how do we produce security for ourselves rather than necessarily feel like we have to rely on or invest in these institutions. I also think, right, like individually, like we can, you know, challenge other people, right? We can have these conversations, we can learn, right? Like we can change our thinking about things too, right? Like, I mean, I feel like there's, you know, a lot of things that we can do.
Thank you. Sounds great.
Other questions? Thank you, Declan. Are there other questions from the community? One of the other things that you, we were talking about, Priya, is talking about the long history of Black radical organizing that might be helpful in thinking about movements for social change in the contemporary moment. And can you say a little bit more about that?
Sure. I think, like, I mean, one of the things that I think is really important in this particular moment, and really in thinking about anti-racist work more generally, is following the leadership of people who are most impacted, right? And so thinking about not just like, what does it mean to respond to the problem as people who benefit from a structure, but actually how do people who are oppressed by a structure want to respond to it, right? And sort of following that lead. You know, one of the things, like I've, like sort of one example I've been thinking about a lot lately, right, with the COVID pandemic, and particularly kind of the racialized impact that we're seeing in terms of infection rates and deaths, is the Black Panther Party, right? And a lot of people know the Black Panther Party as, you know, this Black radical group that walked around with guns and police the police and sort of that aspect of what they did. But another thing that the Black Panther Party did was, right, they believed in principle of self-determination, right? Like that Black communities should be self-determining. And that in order for Black communities to be self-determining, that means that Black communities also had to sort of develop, right, their own resources, their own economies, their own ways of taking care of each other. So like one of the, like, I think most remarkable projects of the Black Panther Party was setting up community health clinics here in Oakland, actually, and in other parts of the country as well, in which, right, part of what they did was not just provide health, like access to healthcare for people who live in those communities, but also really thought about, like, what does healthcare look like that doesn't come from, you know, a Western medicalized model, and like what could like radical healthcare that was about Black liberation look like. And for them, that meant that like self-determination had to be a part of, you know, a patient's experience of healthcare, right? That healthcare was no longer like, you know, like a doctor who is an expert and a patient who just is supposed to do what they're told. Instead, right, like people had to be regarded as equals. That healthcare had to be, right, like delivered in ways that were accessible and educational, and that were, right, you know, that conveyed, right, like a deep love and respect for the people in your community, right? It meant not just kind of creating your own version of what already exists, but actually rethinking what care looks like from a perspective grounded in a particular community. And so, like, I think a lot about examples of those like that in terms of thinking about what are kind of, or how can political movements actually like produce, even if it's on a small scale, forms of self-determination for marginalized communities.
Thank you for that. I've been thinking a lot about the Black Lives Matter movement, Black Lives Matter. And I've been hearing a lot of criticism about the movement. One of them is that there is no real sort of strategy for how we should move forward. And I was wondering what you thought about that, and if you thought that was true. And if there is strategy, or if there's just a different way of thinking about how we should strategize in these times.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think that there is strategy, right? I think movements are always like diffuse, and lots of different organizations doing many different things. Like, I mean, in hindsight, like we can look back at the civil rights movement and say, it was really strategic in achieving these like things. And also, I'm sure that in that historical moment, people thought of it as lacking in strategy, right? Or, you know, so like, I think that's one of those things is sort of like just being in it. I mean, I think if you go to like, for example, like the Movement for Black Lives, like they have a very well articulated political platform of what they want. That is really quite beautiful, you know, and ranges from not just like ending police violence, but like universal health care, resource redistribution, right? Like a very well thought through, developed list of demands. I think that, you know, when we look at activism now, like on the ground, I mean, we're in a very like, I don't know, we're in a very interesting moment as a country, and like we have a great deal of geographical diversity. Like I think that like what the struggle looks like in Minneapolis is really different than like what the struggle looks like in rural Alabama versus what the struggle looks like in California. And so I do think that like you do see a lot of difference in what people are doing and how people are approaching things because their local contexts are different, and because we have a federal government that is probably, I don't know, probably not going to intervene on behalf of Black lives. Like a lot of energy is focused, right, in these more local places. And so it does look different in different places, but I think that that's like a product of the circumstance, and I think that was actually really smart. You know, and I think that like Black Lives Matter as, you know, not just like as a slogan, right, or as a hashtag. I mean, I think it's done tremendous work in terms of shifting cultural consciousness of certain things. Like I think about how different the response to George Floyd's murder is to the beating of Rodney King, right, in the 1990s. I think that it is very different now, and the response is different. I also think that there's a lot of danger that like Black Lives Matter comes to be co-opted by anyone and everyone without substantial change, right? Like, so, right, like Bank of America says Black Lives Matter, or, but that doesn't necessarily change their racist lending policies when it comes to who gets to, you know, get a loan to buy a home, right? So I do think like we have to continue to push for structural change and not just kind of more superficial acknowledgement. But I think it's like, I mean, I think as a movement, it's very exciting and there's a lot of possibility.
There's a raised hand. Shelly Maya, do you have a question?
Sorry, I had to unmute. Hi, Priya. Thank you.
Hi.
You talked about the movements being co-opted, because one thing I always notice is that you'll have a lot of innovative things happening in civil rights forever, that because of the, like what you said, the intersectionality perhaps of another, you know, like perhaps maybe like a white woman or, you know, any other oppressed group that isn't necessarily Black is able to implement and receive the benefits of those ideas that were originated in the struggle, in the Black struggle, and you'll see those rights come through for them much more quickly than it will for Black people. And so I'm just, it's not really like necessarily a question, but I'm really, I guess I'm trying to figure out how to be more and more adamant that we have to center Blackness. Like, for example, even with Black Lives Matter, Black Lives Matter is to me, you know, that slogan, like how it upsets so many people and has, you know, it and I don't know, like I struggle with trying to figure out like what is the problem? Why can't we just focus on them?
Mm-hmm.
And you know, I don't know. It's kind of a, because I don't have a PhD in this stuff. I'm just like, you know, more like I'm emotional about it, you know, still. So and now I forgot kind of what my question was. I had another question too, and since we kept talking. So I'd like to talk more, I guess, about like how the importance of why we must remain focused, if you believe that, on Black people, you know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you said that very well, right? Like that's really important and insightful. And like, I mean, a couple of things I just want to reiterate that really you already said. A lot of people have benefited from Black activism, right? And I think that it's important that all people who benefit from Black activism, and like that is like all people of color, that is women, that is right, like you know, working class people, right, like need to really think about and acknowledge like how the lives they live are really indebted to those Black struggles and turn around and lift up those struggles, right? Like I think that that's really, really important. And often people forget, right? Like that actually, you know, like for example, like the reason that like I could get a PhD has a lot to do with Black struggle, right? And the way in which, right, Black people advocated for Black studies, for ethnic studies, for the presence of people of color on college campuses. And without that, like I couldn't live the life that I live, right? And I think that that's, you know, if we all start to think about it, that's true for most of us. And so I think that's really important to say. And in terms of like centering anti-Blackness, right? And really like, you know, sitting with that. Like, I think that, like, I also wonder about this, right? Like, why is it so difficult, right? Like, why does it make people so angry? And I think that, like, it really threatens, like, what people believe this country is about, right, at its core. You know, I think that, like, we have a deep investment in believing that, like, you know, this is a country where, like, people work hard and then they succeed, right? Like, we have a deep investment in that. And, like, the history of anti-Black racism really shows that that's not true, right? And that it's deep, like really sitting with it is deeply challenging. There's a legal scholar by the name of Cheryl Harris, and I think, you know, like, she talks about, like, this idea that, like, what whiteness is it's not a guarantee that, like, you know, you will win or you will come out on top, but it is a guarantee that you won't be on the bottom. And I think that there's a lot of truth in that, right? And that, you know, white identity is at some level grounded in, and I think, you know, to varying degrees, we could talk about other communities of color too, but grounded in, at least at some level, right, not being Black. And so engaging with Black Lives Matter, I don't know, I think that that's why it elicits that sort of really deep emotional response. This is really challenging, right? But I also think, like, I mean, on the flip side, I do think, right, that, like, we are engaging more deeply with anti-Blackness in this current moment than we have in, like, decades, if not centuries, of, right, you know, US history. And I think that, you know, things change not just because people sort of have change of hearts, but people have change of hearts because people start changing things, right? And I think that people are changing things and are, like, forcing people, right, to grapple with anti-Black racism. And that's really, really powerful, right? Yeah.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Priya. Thank you for sharing with us today. And thanks to all of you who participated and asked questions and listened and are taking notes and are trying to sit with all of what's here. Thank you, Priya. And Kai, can you come forward and help us to digest all of this material?
Absolutely. So again, remember the power of movement and flow. Feel your feet on the ground, stretch the toes. We are not here today to feel bad about ourselves, but to look hard at our shadow and to learn and to grow and to unify. So let all of these great questions, let the teachings of Priya help awaken in you a commitment, because all people's equality and freedom is going to liberate you. And Shelemaya asked a really great question. So wherever we've gone in our individual journey as we've been listening, as we run it through our own filters and backgrounds, let's bring it back to why we are here in this 6-week course, right? George Floyd brought us together with the loss of his life to look at what we are doing in this country. Black lives do matter. That is the focus. That is the house that is on fire. And there are a lot of places we can go that need healing. So take your moment to go in and look at yourself, but let's keep bringing the juice back and not dilute this really important movement that our school is a part of. And Declan asked a great question. What can I do? What can I do to make a difference? So as you take a moment to hydrate, breathe, and move, find in your body again any tension. Bring love, bring movement, right? Good massage. Find where your body wants to hold back or shut down. Find the place in you that wants to cover your eyes, right? I've heard enough. I don't want to see anymore. And really lift the visors off. As we get ready for our last speaker, really find that place in you that says yes. Right? And feel the support of our spirit guides, our grandmothers, our grandfathers. Feel the celebration of all of the indigenous people who have suffered, who are here watching us, right? The spirit of the first people in this country, the grandmothers and grandfathers of the slaves that were brought over, watching us do this work. Feel their support. Nice deep breath again. One more breath. Just let go any places where you hold judgment about yourself and others, and make space as you inhale for the unifying light of your core essence, where we are all brothers and sisters, connected to nature. And again, I thank everyone for being here, all of those who are still here. Take a breath and be more here. And Patricia, we look forward to hearing our next speaker that you brought to us.
Hi there. I was trying to do some, headstands, shake things around. Our final speaker today is Dr. Samuel Kimbles. Dr. Kimbles is a psychologist, a Jungian analyst, former president of the C.J. Jung Institute of San Francisco, and a clinical professor in the Department of Family and Community Medicine, University of California, San Francisco, sorry. He has a private practice in San Francisco, and he works as a clinical consultant to organizations and has published works on the cultural complex. His books include Phantom Narratives, The Unseen Contributions of Culture to the Psyche, and there's a forthcoming book called The Suffering of Ghosts, Intergenerational Complexes and Analytical Psychology. Dr. Kimbles, welcome to the Barbara Brennan School of Healing and to the series Healing the Racial Divide. I'm really pleased to meet you. Where are you?
Okay, thank you very much. I'm glad to be here and join and share and see where we get to today together.
Yeah, I wanted to start off by asking about phantom narratives. What are some of these phantom narratives that you write about? How are they shaping our lives and our daily decisions without us even knowing? How are they contributing to what's happening in our country right now? How do they contribute to the daily killings of Black people by the police, for example? So I wonder if you could start by sort of talking about these phantom narratives.
Yes, of course. Phantom narratives is actually a term or a way that I began to frame some of the work I had done with another concept which I'll be talking about today. And that other concept was cultural complexes. And essentially, cultural complexes was my way of trying to make some room for the psychology of how the psyche works when it processes both individual as well as group relations. And especially that came up in relationship to large group processes like racism or sexism or gender issues and so forth and so on, where the identity of the group is primary in terms of the kinds of shared experiences that people have. So in sitting with cultural complexes and working with groups and talking to groups and watching what happens in the news and so forth and so on, I realized that the psyche, if we take the psyche as the starting point, and I'll be talking some more about that as we go along here, then there's something in ourselves that actually processes our relationship to the group, our experiences of the group, our identification with the group, in terms of how we perceive ourselves in the world of other groups and so forth and so on. So that's one point. I'll make more as we go along here. But the other thing I noticed was that the psyche, our psyches, actually generate story formations, narratives that seem to place the things and events that happen to us within some sort of psychic context. So actually relating to the phantom narratives allow us to have a framework for the kinds of experiences we are having in groups and individually. Racism is one of those phantom narratives that has not just a political and objective place that we can see the consequences of it, but it also has deep historical transgenerational roots. And most times when we begin to talk about race, very shortly we drop into a very deep level in which some of the experiences that we're sharing and we're talking about, we realize have shaped us from before the time that we were born or before our parents were born. And those stories, our psyche seem to be saying, are very important and necessary for us to find our way forward. So that's it in a little bit of a nutshell. And as we go through, hopefully I have a couple of examples that I'll use to articulate what phantom narratives are, what cultural complexes are, and how these can be used for us in trying to understand the political situation that we find ourselves in at this time. Actually, I'll be talking about cultural complexes and phantom narratives, but what I like for the audience to know is that there are actually two big viruses that we are also talking about. I'll be talking about. One is COVID, of course, and the other one is racism itself, which is another kind of virus. And they both are invisible. They both have very concrete effects, and they both are deadly. And I think if we can keep those two things in mind, then we can see how when we begin to talk about something like healthcare disparities and so forth and so on, you can see how the cultural complexes that have generated the inequalities in our culture are flushed out by COVID in some particular way, that we begin to see that those two things have something to say about our humanity, who we are as human beings, and our commitments to each other, and so forth and so on. So that's kind of a short answer to a very complicated question.
Okay, so will you go ahead with the presentation?
Okay, good. Thank you for the question. Since I'll be talking about concepts a bit, I also be using images as a way to elaborate on the concepts. And so what I'd like to do is set a little tone for you for the paper, which is not very long. Patricia asked me to limit it to 20, 25 minutes or so. So we'll pack a lot in that 20 and 25 minutes, and hopefully be on top of your questions, and we can get into some of the questions that you have about any of the things we're talking about, and so forth and so on. But so let me set the tone and read you. Most times when I do a paper, write a paper, I give myself a little title. It helps to organize my thinking and my reactions and hold things together for me as I go through writing the paper. And so for this paper, the title is Stony the Road, Stony the Road. And it's from the Black National Anthem, Lift Every Hand. And I'm going to read to you just a little bit of it from little stanzas from which Stony the Road comes from. Because what I'll be describing is a stony road. Essentially what that means is a hard road that we've all had to walk as we've dealt with these issues around race and racism. So here's the short little version of the song. By the way, I must say that over the 4th of July, I didn't quite know what we would be doing. I didn't think we were doing any kind of celebration for the 4th of July, but I did find myself listening to the Black National Anthem, Lift Every Voice, and I found myself really dropping into incredible mourning. And the mourning was a response to the recognition that we've been doing this for a long time. And it's hard to think in terms of progress at times when we let ourselves drop into where we are culturally and racially and so forth. But there I was, dropping into it. And when I dropped into it, I thought about the anthem. And I got it, I listened to it, and this little stanza stood out for me. Stony the road we trod, bitter the chastening rod, fell in the days when hope unborn had died. Yet with a steady beat, have not our weary feet come to a place for which our Father sighed. Come to a place for which our Father sighed. And I think of what I'll be talking about is a place where we sigh, where we exhale, actually, recognizing that we've taken on a certain kind of consciousness to look at racism, and to look at some of the problems in our culture. And when we do and we begin to take it in, we begin to suffer. And not just our personal suffering, but the suffering of the world. There's so much suffering today in our world. And COVID has exposed the racialized suffering in ways that I think can help us, really. Because as I've gone through my work, seeing my patients and all, I hardly go through a day where people do not bring up something to do with COVID. But in addition, hardly do I go through a day where people don't bring up something about a racial upset and what's happening in the culture today around race and racism. So they are in the popular and the collective mind intertwined in some particular way. And I've come to think about that partially as the material that people have shared pointed to, some people think that finally we as human beings see that we are basically one, that we're interdependent and so forth. And so we can see this as a great opportunity to grab hold of a unitive kind of consciousness. The other group, equally articulate, say, yeah, that's very interesting to think that way about it, but I actually think that we're on the verge of an apocalypse and that we are going toward the end. And the term apocalypse is a very interesting term, which means essentially revelation. So either side you take of that argument, whether we are going to have a unitive consciousness or we're going to apocalypse, something is being revealed that comes from the self, to use a Jungian term, self, big S self, not the small self of the ego or the personal self, but the big self. Something is being revealed. So please keep that in mind as we are talking. We're talking about processes and forces that are coming to our consciousness. We have a chance to engage them individually. We must engage them collectively and culturally and as a group. And we'll see where all that goes. So I'm going to jump through this pretty rapidly so I don't get over the timeline. But essentially, if you think about the Declaration of Independence, at least the part that we tend to quote, all men are created equal, endowed by created with unalienable rights, that kind of thing. What we have to understand is that those are aspirations, our country's aspirations. They have not been met by any shake of the pen. They've not been met. And that so much of our suffering has to do with the tension between the aspiration and the actual reality that we have to face in relationship to these issues. I would present the first little image of where we are with the difference between the aspiration and where we're at, and the problem that seemed to be behind that. Political activist Cornel West has used a number of times, and other people have used this image also, which is that he thinks about the Declaration of Independence as the serpent that was coiled around the leg of a table on which the Declaration of Independence was signed by our founding fathers. It's a very interesting image because what it suggests is that when the founding fathers were setting up the Declaration of Independence, half of them slave owners, half not, they had this contradiction that they had to struggle with and deal with. We don't know quite what they dealt with it, but there was some conversations about it. I'm suggesting that we have inherited that serpent, and that's part of what we're having to struggle with in today's work. So essentially what I'll be presenting to you is a psychological orientation to all the things I'm talking about, but more importantly, politics and policies and cultural issues, racism and gender issues and so on and so on. There is a psychological attitude toward that, and it doesn't go in contradistinction to policy and political attitudes, which are also real. But I do think if we're going to talk about healing, that one of the things that seems to be missing is a psychological attitude toward the kinds of suffering that we have. And I'm not just talking about mental health. For sure, there are mental health issues that are outcome of traumatic issues related to race and so forth and so on. But no psychological issues in the sense that we take an attitude toward that aspect of our being, bigger than our egos, bigger than our subjectivity, that seems to have some sort of autonomy and that knits together the multiple experiences we have individually and as a group in some sort of way that makes for a whole, and it gets back to the phantom narrative. And when we take into account a psychological attitude, that's the level at which I'm suggesting we need to relate to, because it's in us. There's something in us that works to sort of bring all that together The problem in doing that for most of us is that we have to understand what it is that we're experiencing. The experience didn't just come all out from there, and they didn't just come from all in here. They come both from out there and here, and something seemed to be trying to knit those things together. So that's a psychological attitude in the sense it comes from the psyche. So I'm going to introduce you to the term cultural complex pretty quickly here and give you some ways to think about the two examples I'm going to use that illustrate cultural complexes. I think it'll allow you to sort of get a sense of what I've just been talking about. So it's a bigger term, but I'm just going to give you some bookmarks so you can have those to use to think about. And so when I talk about a cultural complex, I'm talking about the group's expectation, its definition of itself, and its destiny. The group's expectation of itself and destiny. So essentially what that means, if you talk with a member of any subgroup, you'll find them saying something about who they feel they are and what their history has been, how they got there, and so forth and so on. So there's an identification with the group. That's automatic. We are, before we're an individual, we're a member of a family and then a member of a group in the school and so forth and so on. By the time we become conscious, we have internalized the group of which we are a part. And it takes a lot of work to become a person separate from the identification with the group if we want to do that. The second idea that cultural complex present, it serves the need to belong and to have an identity, whether it's racial, ethnic, religious, or gender. It serves the need to belong. That's an instinctive thing that operates in our relationship to the group and in us. The third thing is it imposes, because of the identification and belonging, the cultural complex constrains our perceptions of differences. And sometimes it accentuates the differences. So we're making differences from that particular point of our identification with the group. Again, all this is happening automatically. We get some consciousness, begin to work with what's happening automatically, and we can do something with that. But that's what I'm talking about, unconscious processes at the level of the group and the individual. There's a group in the individual as well as a group outside the individual, but we're in the group, even as we are individuals. So the cultural complex allows us to relate psychologically to cultural factors, and the cultural complex helps us to narrate our experiences as a member of the group and being into the group. So I made reference to that before, but just think about all the things, those 5 points, as really automatic things that happen. If we were to sit together for a half an hour or a couple of hours, I do work with groups, and we sit together for a weekend or 3 days, studying ourselves as members of groups. And I tell you, very shortly thereafter, starting the group, you find that you're dealing with something called a group. You thought it was just you, but you have been used by the group in some particular way. We cannot escape our group membership except to become conscious of how we respond, our vulnerability to group, our valences for certain kinds of roles in group leadership or scapegoats or something like that. Okay, so here are the two examples. Get those out quickly. I want to give the example that we are all pretty much familiar with of George Floyd. George Floyd was murdered, as we know, by a police officer who, when you look at the video, when I looked at the video, seems nonchalant, like he had his hands in his pocket. He was looking around as if it was an ordinary day. And Floyd was on his stomach, handcuffed. I think his feet was bound. He was not going anywhere. And this man had his knee on his neck, and we watched him be murdered. And that's a very powerful sort of thing. But I think when I thought about just the kinds of responses that people have had to Floyd, I said, what happened here? Black men are killed all the time. What happened here that made it so outrageous that human beings all over the world see this as some sort of prototype of something that's outrageous? It's inhumane, it's cruel, it's beyond racism, but it is racism at the cruelest level. So I thought it was also a reflection of subjugation, the terror, the cruelty of feeling subjugated, to be dehumanized in front of the whole world. The officer was looking at the world as if the world agreed with what he was doing. There was no shame I could detect. So that looking into the world as if you're doing something ordinary and we're looking back on is what I really want to focus on for just a moment, because I think this is where a cultural complex is in operation. The external aspect of the cultural complex, a murder is occurring, a white cop is killing a black man who is helpless, and we're all watching this. There have been a number of black men killed, so we've seen a number of those, but this was different in some odd way. So, as I said, I wonder what is this that we're looking at that's so absolutely powerful and stimulating for the world? And I thought the officer was looking that nonchalant because he felt that those watching him were agreeing with what he was doing, had no problem with that. He was at home with certain kinds of attitudes toward what he was doing, and assuming that the group around him had that attitude. Now I want to read you something from Jung, who had to deal with the Second World War, the Nazis and the Holocaust, and he struggled with the issue of evil. But I thought about this little paragraph as I began to think about George Floyd and what we were looking at. And I thought about it in terms of its implication for us, because I think we are implicated in what we saw. Here's a quote, "The sight of evil kindles evil in the soul. There's no getting away from this fact. The victim is not the only sufferer. Everybody in the vicinity of the crime, including the murderers, suffers with him. Something of the abysmal darkness of the world has broken in on us, poisoning the very air we breathe and befouling the pure water with the stale, nauseating taste of blood. We can't see evil without being affected by it. And we have to ask ourselves, what is our part of that? How are we implicated in that? That's accepting our greater darkness. I have a line from James Baldwin at the end. He said, if we dare to look beyond our willed innocence, if we look around unflinchingly, then we can step forward to our larger darkness as human beings. As human beings. So there's something in the darkness of Floyd and the murder that we are responding to and we have to take up. The second example, I wanted to show you, bring this example in to show you that there is racism is a continuum. The continuum I'm bringing in for the second example is Amy Cooper's incident, the woman who was asked, she was walking her dog in Central Park, asked to take, her dog was off leash, asked to put her dog back on leash by a black man, and she sort of went berserk. And she called the police, and she said, I'm threatened by this African-American man, and so forth and so on. She was in hysterics, as you know. Now, what's really interesting about that, this is another example of unconscious racism. This is a woman who has apparently good job, educated, and so forth. She is the least likely to call herself racist by any means. But at that moment, she was activated and taken over by some aspect of the self. And she ended up weaponizing her vulnerability and her tears. She knew exactly, if she said that key word threatened by an African-American man, that would assure that the officers who responded would know where the problem was. But fortunately, it didn't turn out that way. Fortunately, it turned out another way, where she had her consequences. The man who was called, the African-American man, had a way to talk about it. Fortunately, he had recorded it. And so what Amy Cooper showed is that something that we rarely talk about, but when we talk about structural racism, what we're talking about racism without being a racist. That's essentially what that shows. A racist is not simply someone who wear a hood and burn down churches and kill young people and black men. A racist is someone who's comfortably knitted into the power of social structure in such a way that he or she works on the basis of certain kinds of assumptions. That is racism, pure and simple. And Amy Cooper used that in that moment to find some comfort in what she found herself in. It could have been simple as, how dare you, a black man, ask me to do anything? We don't know what her psychology is about that, but I want you to see that Amy Cooper's situation in Florida is on a continuum. Racism is a continuum, but particularly to see that it's possible that most of what we call racism is different in the minds of many people, especially liberal people, than being a racist. Nonetheless, it's the same continuum. Let me quickly get to something here. Just in terms of the healing, I have a couple of colleagues and friends who've been working on a psychological case for reparation. And it's again, taking up the psychological attitude toward reparation. Essentially, the elements that they say, and which I'm saying also, is that reparation has to involve some sort of acknowledgement around the sin of slavery. The sin of slavery and the absolute inhumanity that has come with that, and its subsequent histories. That would have to be acknowledged. And the historical consequences of slavery has been expressed in ongoing white terrorism, whether it's Jim Crow or lynching or shooting unarmed black men. I don't know if you saw after the fellow was shot in Georgia, the mayor of Atlanta, it's a black woman, and she was being interviewed, and she said, you know, if I were alone, being put in a car with two white cops at nighttime, I would be tempted to run. That's terrorism. That's how deep it is. When the mayor tells you something pretty clearly, what could have happened for that young man to run. So something would have to be acknowledged. If not, we are haunted by the ghosts. And this is where the phantom narratives come in. Ghosts are part of phantom narrative. Ghosts are there because we have not dealt with caused them to become so. And I'll give you a little bit of a line from a psychoanalyst named Lowell. He was talking about families, but here's something that I think applies to ghosts, which let's call ghosts unacknowledged grievances and historical processes that have not been processed by So here's Lowell. Lowell said, those who know ghosts tell us that they long to be released from their ghost life and laid to rest as ancestors. As ancestors, they live forth in the present generation, while as ghosts, they are compelled to hunt the present generation with their shadow life. Understand this, that ghosts are around and hunt us because they have not been dealt with. They have not been acknowledged. The crimes against humanity, the terrorism that followed slavery, all that has to be acknowledged before the ghosts will go away. Otherwise, the ghosts keep generating problems for us to deal with, like we see every day in the newspaper. So what you just heard me talk about in a quick little bunch of statements here is complex, cultural complexes, these automatic processes in our psychic life that pull together group and individual processes having to do with identities and belonging and group identification. We have a history that comes with identification and so forth and so on. Our psyche generates a narrative structure that locates the events that we are dealing with into a history. And so the situation with Floyd and with Amy Cooper have a history that we can call a phantom narrative because in aspects of our story that we need to deal with if we are to let our ghosts go back to their lives. Okay, I think I've gone over my 20 minutes, but it's a fast, there's a lot of materials there, lots of things to talk about. I'm open to questions. I'd like to hear what you're thinking, what you want to ask, and let's go with it.
Are there any questions? Natasha? Is Gwen Reese speaking?
Julie Murray to everyone.
No, it's Natasha.
Natasha?
Natasha, I don't know if it's a question or a statement, but can you put together like cultural complexes and goals?
Yes.
Because that unsettling, I think, is like what you said, is what keeps us unsettled, because they can't rest until their wrong have been acknowledged. But we don't talk about that.
Exactly. You just hit it all on the head there. You're right. We can't settle and they can't settle because the ghosts are demanding, let's say, to be acknowledged, and the harm and hurt done that generated the ghosts are needing to be corrected. From a positive psychological point of view, ghosts are coming and they're hanging around to remind us of what needs to be acknowledged and what we need to work with in order to go forward with a problem or an issue. So we have lots of ghosts around slavery because we've not acknowledged it. We've not done the work around the violence and the cruelty that's a part of that historical and present situation. And so what else can that repress, suppress, unacknowledged material do but come back and get reenacted many, many times in many different ways by individuals and as groups. And we keep trying to work it out politically, but these are deep psychological and spiritual problems. And until we can begin to talk about it from that point of view, we'll keep having these incidents happen. And I think we all end up feeling discouraged, defeated. Is that the answer, Natasha? Did that help at all?
Yes, I mean, you speak on it. You're an elder, you've experienced more, and you will know more. So it's like the complex, essentially what I'm getting, the complex that we have culturally is based on not addressing the atrocities that have went on in this country.
Absolutely.
You know, with Black people. And nothing else to be said. Until we talk about that, are we talking about anything?
Yeah. Yeah, not just Black people, but Native people, you know, gender people, transgender people. Differences are really a trigger for anxiety. And when we see differences, we tend to think of it as a negative thing, a bad thing, a threatening thing. And so once the anxiety about the difference comes up, then we get scapegoats. And scapegoating is a way to make the bad thing, put the bad thing into one person or a group. And then all we have to do is get rid of the group or the bad person. And then the scapegoated person carries something for us, which is the unacknowledged fear that we have. And if you get into the psychology of whites' attitude toward Blacks, there's so much there in terms of the fantasy system that many whites have about who Black people are. And there, in short, is just incredible amount of fear and fascination. Fear and fascination. And that is an incredible mix because it creates all kinds of odd situations for us to deal with. And some of this, if you really want to get back to a person I've read who almost all the Black novelists and writers have spoken to this, but Toni Morrison, Playing in the Dark, is really worth looking at. What you see when she brings forward that in looking at the canon, white canon, the novels and literature of the 19th century, she said, just notice what happens to the scene and the material when a Black person appears. It changes. And what she's saying is that the author who's writing the book does not recognize that he or she has a fantasy about who the Black person is, or what a Black person is. And so they make use of the Black person in order to express, to use my language, a cultural complex.
Great. There are two raised hands. First person.
This is Laurel.
That's me.
Laurel.
Hi, thank you so much for what you've said. I've been thinking a lot the last few months about how this country, you know, it starts out with stealing people from their homes, bringing them over here, enslaving them. And then once the slavery was over, Jim Crow, and now the police killing people. And it just looks to me like a no-win scenario. It's like you just can't get out from under it. And it seems to me like this country is never going to get past this unless they admit the original sin of theft and stealing people from their homes. And I was wondering what your opinion is of how we can get through that. I mean, how can we move past that to help heal this?
Yeah. Well, again, first of all, the moving past, we have to acknowledge that something was done. The traumatic disruption of a people's lives, separation from family and country and so forth, we have to acknowledge that that is a violence that we did and that we have continued that violence and terrorism over the past 300 or 400 years in one form or other. And the question is, why do we continue it? Well, one understanding of it is that, well, it's a way of, in this George Floyd situation, of continuing subjugation, separating people based on color so that fear becomes a part of what keeps people separated. But another reason would be that we just not acknowledge that we did something horrible. We have something horrible we did in our past that we need to own. And what does that look like? Well, the only term that we have that comes close to that is reparation. At first it was 40 acres and a mule. We don't need 40 acres and a mule. What we need is some real apologies and some acknowledgement that some heavy duty stuff was done. And we need to talk about that. There was a, I wish I had a way to point you to it, but it was a group of white folks. It feels like they were part of a community, and Black folks meeting each other. All the whites in the clip were on their knees apologizing, wailing apologies. I'm sorry to hurt you. I'm sorry for what we did, for my people, my history, God, and wailing. And the Black people were just full of tears. And I thought, well, there it is. That's what we're needing, and that's what we're longing for, some sort of coming together where the grief and the harm can be acknowledged and we can hear each other through our mutual pain. So that's the healing. The healing is to go for that. But I think to get there, we have to get to the psychology. We have to get to the psyche that generates these problems to begin with, because so much of what I'm talking about are mechanical things that happen in the mind and happen in our just trying to feel safe and comfortable enough to be with other people. Things just happen. So we need some consciousness, but we need consciousness of how the psyche works, not just in us, but in ourselves and groups and that kind of thing.
Other questions? I had a question, Dr. Kimball's. Who do you think should do the apologizing? Should it be the government? Should it be every, how do we even begin that?
Yeah, well, I think it begins with the leadership pointing the way to the need to do some atonement and apologies. And that could, it's sort of like wearing the mask and the COVID, you know, since the leadership is not particularly supporting masks and so forth, people kind of do things on their own. But we do need some leadership. I was thinking about Gates and Obama. I forget his first name, but Gates was a professor at the, he's still a professor.
Henry Louis Gates, yeah.
Yes, and he had that incident in which he was coming home and had locked himself out, and he and his driver were trying to get in the door, and someone called the cops on him, and they arrested him. And Obama, as president, saw that as a teachable moment and brought them both to the White House. Well, that was leadership. That was like, this is how you do it. You call out in this case, a cultural complex. The police officer thought he was just doing his job, but it was a Black man. So it triggered all kinds of automatic responding and so forth. But when the president does it, acknowledges something, then you got somebody who's willing to hold the situation with you, help you to process it. We'll make a commitment together. You can bring some resources to deal with such issues. So I think it started with leadership at not just the national level, but local level and so forth and so on, with the willingness to acknowledge some of these sorts of things, and then we can move to a bigger sort of statement.
Thank you. Other questions?
Melanie has a question. Melanie Roche.
Thanks for calling on me, Lisa. Patricia, is that all right with you if I ask the question?
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Kimball's very, very, very moving. And I'm grateful that you're talking about the inner psychology with the cultural complexes. And so I get confused as a healer between working for outer societal change in the way that Suzanne, I may be mispronouncing her name, but Plihcik was talking about, and then how to work, let's say, with the inner, the archetypal, the epigenetic, the trauma held. And I wonder if you could speak to that or give any pointers, because I feel like for myself, the argument between wanting to work for political change versus, and it should be both and, but at a certain point in my history, I made a choice to work on the inner and work on the individual and small groups rather than mass movements. And now, of course, I'm rethinking that. But if you could give us any pointers as practitioners, particularly around the epigenetics part and the cultural complexes. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Well, I think we have to deal with some binaries that we are caught in this culture. And one of those binaries has to do with the inner and the outer. So when I mention psychological, people think, oh, what's going on the inside of my head as inner. But that was not Jung's attitude. That's not my attitude. There's no inner in that sense, because the psyche doesn't have those kind of boundaries. These are things that we learn to use as a way to negotiate ourselves. And some of that negotiation take us into looking at our most private and intimate and personal experiences. And some take us to looking out, but we should not assume that when we're looking inner, that we are not also looking at outer stuff. For instance, when I see patients and they bring in some kind of expression of an outer thing, and a lot of one have done that more recently, and I think about, well, I'm trying to think about a person that won't hear me saying this at any time. But I'll tell you of a young boy I saw when he was about 4 years old. He had some anxiety issues, and his mother brought him in, and so we did what we did with that, and they seemed to get better. When he was 5.5 or 6, he had some recurrence of some sort of anxiety, brought him in again. And the mother said, let's call him Ron. Ron, you remember Dr. Campbell? He said, oh, yes, I do, but the last time he was not Black. And I thought, well, that's very, very interesting. Because what he was saying is that I didn't notice his color, but now that I notice his color, it means something. And so, is that inner or is that outer? You know what I mean?
May I ask a question to clarify? Because when I say outer, I understand what you mean, but I really mean in terms of policies or governmental legislation. That's what I mean by outer, and the inner is everything you're talking about.
Yes. Well, the politics and the policies are all around power, which is somewhat outer, but there are also these emotional complexes that come with power. In other words, who gets to make decisions, who gets to control, and so forth. For instance, in looking at those citizens who are most likely to get COVID, and we see the figures of people of color and elderly people and brown and Black bodies and so forth and so on, it's a very, and that's all outside, and it's a very short step toward seeing the kinds of social conditions that have made access to healthcare part of the problem that we're seeing as vulnerability to COVID in some particular way. Those could be addressed in a policy way, in a political way, and they need to be addressed in those particular ways. But those policies and practices are based upon cultural complexes, that is, internal representation of who deserves what. I had, someone said there was a difference when first President Trump was concerned about how many people died until he discovered who was the people who likely to die. And then the policy became live and let die. Now, I don't know if that's true, but that was what came up with it. So the policies are not really outside. They represent internal forces that we put together as a group in order to make things working out to our advantage in some particular way.
So do you have any pointers for us as healers, practitioners, in our listening to this inner expression of cultural complexes and how to how to work with that or how to facilitate. Here's what's happening. I'm getting very triggered by a client who I never knew was so overtly racist. He's being very triggered. He's being very threatened. And so suddenly a whole side of him is coming out that I've never heard in 10 years of working with him. And I can hardly tolerate it. And I don't know how to work with him. And I don't know how to get under it to his fear or his issues or his ghosts or his history.
Yeah. Well, this is very interesting that this aspect of the client came up, and it has, let's say, it's been facilitated by the changing valences that are in the culture itself. And so the client feels either disinhibited or feels the freedom now to let you know of feelings that he has that he cannot tolerate. And he's asking you to be able to hold those feelings, from my point of view, to hold those feelings and reactions with him, because he cannot. So I would say that what you're seeing is a man who has been possessed by white nationalist thoughts. And so that looks like outside, but it really is an internalized set of thoughts that he has taken as who he is and he's having trouble with. Now, you're a treater, and you have to decide what you want to do with that. But I think the difficulty would be to see that as a complex. This would be I call it a cultural complex. It's come right into the session and is asking to be held in a way that can generate a conversation between the two of you about what the experience is and what it represents for him and what it represents for you. So that would move it into the dialogic way of relating that could soften it a little bit, because suddenly whatever the fear and anxiety is behind that will come into the room as something that needs some help to deal with, such a bully attitude, that he has come over him and taken over inside. Yeah, so I would say that's the kind of internal possession he's possessed.
Thank you very much. Very helpful. Appreciate
Thank you,
it.
Melanie. And
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kimball. I think we're about to end at 3, and I think that might be our last question. Do you have any last words for us, Dr. Kimball?
Well, thank you for putting something like this together and allowing some room for some very needed attention to be given to these very deep, intractable problems. And I think just if my little talk is any indication of that, it's really, it's right on, and people are making use of the time and the space. And so congratulations and thank you for having me to be a part of it. It's been great sitting with you.
Yeah, thank you. It's been a pleasure. I'll be in touch with you again.
All right, well, take care, you all, and as they say, stay safe, and until next time. Okay, bye-bye.
Dr. Kimball, hello? Hello, Dr. Kimball?
Yes.
Sorry, this is Shalamaya. Is it possible to contact you? I have a question, but I can ask after. So is it possible that I can ask you that question personally, or?
You can send it to me and I can pass it on.
Okay, cool. Thanks.
Yes, yeah. Okay, that's good enough. Okay, thank you, Patricia. All right.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Lisa, would you like to close?
Sure. Thank you so much to everyone who attended and listened and participated. It was just, for me, it was totally amazing, and I'm so deeply honored and pleased that we're doing all of this, and to everybody that's participating and encouraging us to keep doing it and keep looking at it. And I'm just, again, deeply honored that we're all on this journey together. And I'm looking forward to next week, where we'll be having a panel that will be discussing the effects of racism on the energy field. And so I think that's going to be amazing. And we'll be sending out the recording and information for next week pretty as quick as we can. And so thank you so much for coming.